Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here, whether you've joined us in person or online. Before we begin, I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we live and the waters on which we fish, and pay my respect to elders past and present and to any First Nations people attending this seminar this morning. Sovereignty was never ceded, and understanding this history is an important part of understanding the context of our fisheries sector here in the NT today. As chair of RIEL's Gender Equity and Inclusion Committee, I'm very pleased to be introducing this seminar on the theme of women in fisheries. I'd like to start by sincerely thanking Hannah, Zach and Bill for supporting today's session and for coordinating with our committee to make this happen. This seminar is the first one coordinated by the Gender Equity and Inclusion Committee at RIEL as part of our new effort to highlight research at RIEL engages with themes of equity, diversity and inclusion. We hope this will become a regular feature as part of the RIEL seminar series, perhaps each semester or each year, as a way to share and celebrate how researchers are embedding inclusive approaches in their work. Through this series, we want to shine a light on research that helps us understand groups who are often overlooked or marginalized, that engages with diverse knowledge systems, or that explores how inclusive methods and partnerships can strengthen both our science and its impact. So today's focus on women in fisheries is a way to explore some of those ideas. A gender lens offers us a powerful way to see who is visible and who is missing from our stories about fisheries, whose labour, knowledge and contributions are counted, and whose are overlooked. It allows us to pursue equity and to do better science. So as we begin, I invite you to think about how some of those ideas connect with your own work or your own life. And thank you very much for being here. I look forward to continuing some discussion and Q&A later on. For now, please welcome Nilanjana.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. Today I'll be sharing part of my ongoing PhD research that looks at gendered labour in the context of the commercial seafood sector of the Northern Territory. My work sits at the intersection of gender justice, fisheries, and labour history, and diversity, not biodiversity. Sorry. And it's really about asking, as Jenny pointed out, who gets seen and who is invisible. And by bringing attention to this often unseen work that people put into the industry, I'm hoping to explore what inclusive research can look like in the fisheries and here at RIEL more broadly. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Darwin people, the traditional custodians and owners of the lands and waters on which we meet today, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I also extend that respect to the custodians and elders of the lands and waters from wherever you may be. Those who are online may be joined. So this talk is about shining a light on a hidden part of history, which deals with women's involvement in the Northern Territory seafood industry. Why look at history? When we consider the challenges and inequalities that we see around us, it's important to understand that they didn't appear out of nowhere. They are rooted in the past. To understand the present, we need to look at where those legacies came from. And understanding those legacies is crucial to recognizing the potential, the possibilities that the future holds. So I asked three guiding questions. First, what roles did women play historically, and how did these roles evolve? The second, who were the key players, and how did their changing roles affect women's engagement in the industry and sector? And third, what impact did commercialization have on women's participation? Now, just to introduce the Northern Territory and its seafood sector, almost a third of the NT population identifies as Aboriginal. Yet Aboriginal households earn around 56% less than the NT median. This points to long-standing structural disadvantage where social and economic inequality limits who can participate in and who can benefit from regional industries. So from the start, the seafood sector is operating on an unequal foundation that restricts local participation and opportunity. Second, most NT seafood is exported in raw form with very little processing or branding done locally. That means that much of the value created here leaves the region before it has had a chance to circulate. With limited reinvestment back into local jobs, skills, and businesses, the territory captures only a small share of the wealth generated from its own resources. Three, the seafood workforce is aging and the industry relies heavily on casual contract-based forms of work. This makes it harder to attract and retain skilled workers and to plan for the long term. An unstable workforce ultimately weakens the industry's ability to grow and adapt. Together, these factors, inequality, economic leakage, and workforce fragility, create real barriers to sustainability. In this context, my attempt is to understand women's work in the seafood industry. Now, women's labor cannot be understood by using the same lens that was developed to understand market-based economic work, the kind of work that for many reasons men have come to dominate. Women's work involves unpaid work, undervalued work, which is performed in a variety of settings. To make sense of it, I developed a social provisioning model which draws upon the work of two economists. One is Marilyn Power, the feminist economist, and the second is Carl Polanyi. The model looks at the seafood industry not just as an economic system, but as an economic system embedded in social relations. 5 elements of the model come from Marilyn Power's proposal. Well-being, when I say well-being, I mean wages, conditions of work, but not just that. Other components of social provisioning impact well-being. From Marilyn Power's work comes unpaid labor, which is critical to understand because the more unpaid labor the workforce has to shoulder, the less its well-being experience. Agency, what voice does the workforce have? Ethics, what kind of ethical considerations, gender norms pervade the industry? And diversity, how diverse and representative is the workforce? To these 5 elements, I have added a 6th, which is sector regulation. And this is very important in the NT context, and it will become clearer as we go along. My methodological approach combined selective desk research and archival research, 25 key informant interviews with individuals with long-term industry experience, and group discussions with Aboriginal women. I used a participatory and iterative design to capture diverse perspectives. Now, how we name things shapes how we understand them. In research, the terms and categories we use can either reveal or obscure parts of a story. Building on that idea, I mapped the role of the growth of the NT seafood industry into 4 phases. This staging reflects how the means of production were consolidated over time, from 1950 to present times. This framework helped reveal not only shifts within the industry, but also it reveals how women's roles now became visible, now became obscure, now were redefined, and why. The first phase is organization, what I call organization. Prior to the 1950s, the fisheries was an unorganized sector in the Northern Territory. Fishing at this time was small scale and closely tied to welfare, state-backed welfare policies that were themselves connected to capitalist development goals. 2 types of fishing occurred. One, commercial fishing. This was largely unregulated and led by immigrant communities. The second was led by Christian missions, relying heavily on Aboriginal labor. missions back then were the holding places for Aboriginal communities that were being rapidly displaced from their lands. Mission work was highly gendered. So men built boats, did the fishing, while women did the domestic work, but not in all missions. And this is very important to understand. In those missions where there was an organic linkage with the community, like in places like Gallowin, we have documentation of women as active agents in the fishery. They captained boats, they repaired boat engines, they harvested fish, they packed fish, they repaired nets. They were very active. Aboriginal fishing, and this is very interesting to me, was categorized as subsistence, meaning for own consumption. It was regarded as subsistence fishing. But my research shows two things. One, that much of the fish that was caught was sold commercially. It was flown, air freighted to Darwin and other regional areas, so it was actually sold. And two, the fish that was caught through so-called subsistence fishing exceeded the commercial production in several years in terms of quantity. So the real economic value of Aboriginal fishing was thoroughly hidden, allowing the labor which produced this fish to be thoroughly exploited. This chart shows the wage inequalities that existed in the early 60s. Taking the average wage of white men as 100%, the first bar, we find that white women earned only 75% of the white male wage. Aboriginal men earned around 20%. Aboriginal youth also earned less. But the most exploited was the Aboriginal woman, earning just 5% of the white male wage. So when we see a gender wage gap of around 15% in Australia's seafood industry today, this is work that has been brought to light by WISA. WISA's excellent study by Kirsten Abernethy and Emily Ogier in 2022. They found a 15% wage gap. This did not appear out of nowhere. It is deeply rooted in the racialized and gendered patterns of labor exploitation on which this sector was built. The next 2 decades can be thought of as an era of capitalization. This period was sparked by the discovery of northern prawn. The northern prawn fishery was set up and tied to the Develop the North initiative. It had a developmental focus. So companies that wanted to invest in prawn had to make investments in regional development as well. And this meant that prawn processing factories were created in remote areas like Groote Eylandt and also Darwin. These facilities, we find, became places that generated women's employment. In Groote Eylandt, and I'll just take a moment to remind you that White Australia policy is thoroughly in place at this time that we're talking about. So in Groote Eylandt, local Aboriginal communities successfully negotiated equal wages for their workforce. Their stance was simple and powerful, and I quote, "White fella work, white fella wages, full stop." This, for the first time, meant that Aboriginal women in Groote Eylandt had the opportunity to earn wages at parity with white women who were being flown in from outside, from Cairns, from Victoria, from other places. Opportunities also began to open up at sea. Women worked as deckhands and cooks and radio operators. We must understand that in the 70s, the sector was thoroughly unregulated and it was expanding quickly, which meant that there were more than 350 vessels. And many vessels were new trawlers with sophisticated on-board processing. And when I say this, there should be some music that's ominous, because this was what offered stiff competition to the shore-based processing facilities. Very quickly, here are some pictures of women in 1970 in the Groote Eylandt prawn processing factory. This picture was taken in August this year when I visited Groot. These are all women who had worked in the fishery, in the prawn processing factory back in the 1970s. And they said, and I quote, "Those were the best years for us. We earned a wage, and we were so proud to earn a wage and bring it home. We were heartbroken when the factory shut down." Now, like I said, there was a gold rush in prawn. So this newspaper article of the time is, and the circle the section that I've circled might be too small for you to read. It mentions that women sometimes outnumbered men as crew aboard prawn trawlers. This goes against everything we associate, all the gender stereotypes that we associate with fishing. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the industry hit a turning point. Overfishing and rising stakeholder conflict, which I can't really go into in much depth right now, pushed it into what I call the regulation era. Government policy shifted from encouraging growth to enforcing efficiency. This was very much in line with growing neoliberalism globally. In practice, it meant that a form of fisheries management was introduced, which relied on bioeconomic controls, license buybacks, and reduction to fleet sizes. These changes had real impacts on women. Shore-based processing factories simply could not compete with the sophisticated onboard freezer trawlers. Many were forced to close. When Groot Island's factory shut its doors in 1980, it took away a steady source of employment for Aboriginal women. Now, stricter regulations came aboard, which raised the entry barriers. So Aboriginal communities, small-scale fishing businesses found it very difficult to enter the sector. Ownership became concentrated more and more in larger players' hands. And women's labor in the fisheries was often pushed into unpaid or informal roles within family fishing businesses. And even those women did move into science and regulatory roles or admin roles in government, the leadership of the industry remained overwhelmingly male and non-Indigenous. By the early 2000s, fisheries management in the Northern Territory had moved firmly towards quotas and bioeconomic controls. So there was an attempt to balance economic growth with environmental sustainability, but this completely overlooked the social dimensions of the fishery, gender impacts, community impacts. This growth narrative was somewhat disrupted when in 2008, the Blue Mud Bay ruling was announced. This verdict allowed for legal recognition of Aboriginal communities over intertidal land. Access to the waters now had to be negotiated with traditional owners. It was a historic affirmation of rights, but it also triggered a protracted set of negotiations, which continues to this day. If we fast forward to 2023, women now make up about a quarter of the Northern Territory seafood workforce. But in the core parts of the industry, harvest and post-harvest, women's participation is estimated to be only about 2 to 5%. In other words, women remain largely excluded from the spaces where most value is created. We can see a clear disconnect too between government and industry. In government, gender equity has improved, more women are in senior positions, and public sector representation looks relatively strong. But this progress is not reflected in the industry itself. Aboriginal representation was estimated to be only about 3%, and while we now see growing migrant labor, particularly from Asian countries, Aboriginal participation continues to be low. The emerging aquaculture industry offers new potential, and interestingly, it appears to provide more opportunities for women's employment. And this is something that I'm currently exploring further in my ongoing research. However, structural barriers remain. The industry continues to operate on a resource extraction model. Fish are caught, exported, processed elsewhere. Licensing arrangements are complex. Local value addition is very low. As a result, most economic value leaves the region and benefits to local communities remain small. This also has gender effects. Globally, women's employment, and also in Australia, tends to, for reasons we can discuss later, if needed, tends to go into processing, post-harvest processing and value addition, the very activities that are missing in the NT. By maintaining an extract and export model, the NT industry effectively limits opportunities for women to participate in the fisheries. Finally, in more than 70 years, there has never been a comprehensive socio-economic survey of the workforce. This silence speaks volumes. It tells us how contributions of Aboriginal people and of women have effectively been rendered fairly invisible. To conclude, I want to stress that past choices matter, history matters. Each wave of policy and economic change shaped and reshaped women's roles in the Northern Territory seafood sector and left behind gender legacies. When we view this through a social provisioning lens, the sector appears not only as a market, but as a process rooted in relationships and shared labor. Over time, however, bioeconomic fisheries management has pulled the industry away from its roots in what Karl Polanyi would have called a process of disembedment. Policy choices were central here. This did not happen on its own. The shift from development-oriented to efficiency-oriented policy led to the closure of factories, erased jobs across the sector, and deepened the industry's gender divide. Today, women appear to be fairly well represented on the surface, but that representation is concentrated in administrative and regulatory roles. Following Maria Mies, I describe this as the housewifeization of the sector as a whole. Looking ahead, there is an opportunity to correct course. If more value is retained through local processing, if more inclusive policies are embedded into the system, if there is better policy support for gender disaggregated data, change will come. But this change requires deliberate policy support. Without it, structural inequities will continue. So the takeaway is clear. Women contributed significantly to the sector's past, and with the right policy choices, they can play a central role in shaping its future. I thank you very much for your attention and time. I thank the research, those who have funded and supported the research. I thank my supervisor who's here today, Stacey. I thank RIEL, Sam, for all the support that you give. And thank you, Bill, Zach, and thank you, Hannah, whenever you see this, for all your support. Thank you, Jenny. Over to you.
Well, it's hard to follow such an inspiring presentation, but I'll do my best. So now we're going to move over to the recreational fishing sector.
Sorry, getting there.
No, that's all right. I'll just start while you're doing that. As you may know, recreational fisheries are complex socio-ecological systems which are valued for their social and economic benefits. There we go. Oh, good. Thanks. Including health and well-being brought through social connection, relaxation, and time in nature. In line with other Australian studies, I define recreational fishers as anyone who has fished non-commercially using any gear or method in the past year.
Sorry.
Recreational fishing is popular around the world with an average participation rate of 10.6% across industrialized countries. But as we already know from Nilanjana, fishers are a diverse group, which influences their behaviors, motivations, experiences, environmental impacts, and management needs. And socio-demographic factors are one source of this diversity. So despite growing participation from different groups, recreational fishing remains male-dominated worldwide. And in Australia, much of the fishing media looks something like this example I've put on the slide. Women in recreational fishing are often sexualized or framed in relation to men as competing with or trying to match their standards. But despite this masculinized space, Many women actively participate, gaining benefits such as enjoyment, well-being, challenging gender norms, self-discovery, connecting with nature, and building social connections. Instead of comparing women's fishing to men's, a feminist approach values the diversity of experiences, identities, and priorities of women fishers on their own terms, which is what this study endeavored to do here in the NT. Nationally, a gender gap in participation remains, but the NT has the highest participation rate in the country of 33%, which is shared equally by women and men. And as you can see, the estimates from the national survey, the recent national survey, show that the sector in the NT has a significant economic and employment contribution as well. So while these national surveys highlight the well-being and economic benefits of recreational fishing, they have not yet explored gender differences or the causes behind those differences. So my research examines some of the barriers and enablers for women's participation, their experiences, and the gendered implications for well-being and sector development. So on this map, you can see the scope of this study was limited to the top end. Plus, you can see some of the rivers and key locations of interest that the participants mentioned in the interviews. As we know, the top end includes a high proportion of rural people and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, contributing to a high participation rate in recreational fishing, which is a huge part of territory life and a growing economic sector. Women's recreational fishing here has a long history, following an even longer tradition of Aboriginal women's subsistence fishing and other forms of women's fishing in the territory, as we've heard from Nilanjana, which continues today. Competitions have run since the 1950s, with women's events established more than 20 years ago, including trailblazing competitions mentioned in this presentation's title, and many others. And here you can see a headline from the NT News in 1969, which highlights some inspiring fishing by Julia Christensen of Nightcliff Beach. So we're building on a long history here. I used a feminist approach to examine the gender norms and relations shaping women's fishing experience, with some attention to intersectionalities such as age, health, and family situation. I interviewed 21 women key informants, chosen for their roles in the recreational fishing sector or as active fishers. While this is only an initial exploratory study with many limitations, which I've listed some of the ones here, it provides a foundation for future, more intersectional research in the top end. And this is my wish list of future study on the topic. I should also say that in this presentation, in the paper, the results are largely presented through quotes from the participants. So here I'll be using some of those to highlight key themes, alongside this artist's interpretation of the research. So this is really my findings. So if we ask why women do or do not fish, motivations for fishing aligned with previous studies, but the participants really stressed its accessibility in the NT due to the locations and lack of licensing requirements. Also, due to the lack of the need for physical strength, this was highlighted as a leveler for participation and the potential of fishing ability. The cultures and attitudes of people in the territory were identified as one of the main reasons behind these high participation rates. One participant stated that the widespread fishing culture has normalized seeing women on the water. But despite this overall positive picture, incidents of harassment or negative treatment because of gender in a fishing context were also reported, as well as barriers for women, such as boat ownership or having the right skills. But experienced participants described a significant cultural shift in the last 20 years surrounding women's participation in recreational fishing and attitudes towards them. Participants shared early memories of learning to fish from relatives, whilst others recalled exclusion shaped by gender norms. For example, fathers taking their sons fishing, but not daughters. When fishing is often seen as a family activity, it provides opportunities to learn and lowers barriers for mothers' participation across different life stages. Supportive partners who share caring responsibilities further enable women's involvement. Parents also described encouraging their children to fish, spending time with them on boats, and connecting with nature as a family. The participants unanimously described fishing as vital for well-being and mental health. They shared how it has built their resilience, supported them through challenges such as relationship breakdowns, trauma, illness, boosted their self-esteem, or helped manage stress and chronic health conditions. Several also highlighted the value of accessible infrastructure and initiatives for fishers with disabilities. Social connection is a key enabler for fishing participation, with fishing offering time with friends, family, and romantic partners. Participants linked fishing to major life events, meeting their partners, getting engaged, bringing their babies fishing, and even navigating divorces, showing how deeply fishing intersects with their personal lives. Though, as you can see from these quotes, these dynamics can also create conflict. In addition to the dynamics on the boat, participants also discussed positive and negative interactions at boat ramps, or even within the broader fishing community. For example, feeling patronized, feeling self-conscious, or encountering encouraging people. Some, particularly the younger women I spoke to, said they faced no gender barriers, and many felt most men were very supportive of women's fishing. In fact, though I mentioned that recreational fishing can be a masculinized environment that has the potential to exclude women, the data also demonstrated experiences of various positive masculinities associated with caring, fatherhood, connection with nature, and environmental stewardship. Though this topic of fishing masculinities could do with a whole presentation of its own. Lack of skills and knowledge was identified as a major barrier to participation. Beyond technical abilities like casting, knot tying, boat handling, or reading rivers, participants emphasized the need for motivation and confidence to overcome that initial learning curve. Alongside learning through social connections, participants highlighted the value of tackle shops and competitions as important ways to access information and build skills. Opportunities to develop these skills may be more limited for some women due to gender norms that influence the type of professions women occupy, making it important to create more chances to learn and practice those skills. Some women's own attitudes and self-doubts were seen as barriers, especially in navigating a male-dominated environment. However, these beliefs were often attributed to the stereotype of fishing as a masculine place, rather than the current reality of the top end. Experienced women often mentor others, with informal networks and women's competitions providing unique learning opportunities, with these events also helping to increase the visibility of women's fishing. While some prefer women-only events, others see them as a stepping stone towards equal participation in open competitions. And reasons for not entering those competitions included costs, the drinking culture, or preferring to fish solo or outside of a competitive setting. And the representation of women in recreational fishing was discussed in relation to traditional and social media, as well as fisheries governance and management. Some participants felt media coverage rarely reflected the high level of women's participation in the NT. In contrast, women's competitions have attracted some attention, and women have featured regularly on fishing radio shows. Many noted the value of this visibility. But across different ages, participants criticized over-sexualized imagery and unrealistic beauty standards, saying these shape perceptions and make it harder for women to gain respect. Older women in particular spoke about their experiences of needing to earn respect from male fishers when they started and prove themselves as capable anglers. Some distanced themselves from certain behaviors, such as heavy drinking at events, as they felt this could impact how seriously they were taken. While participants were critical of how women have traditionally been portrayed in fishing media, many agreed that representation has been improving, often through increased coverage of those competitions. The issue is further complicated by how women are represented on social media, including how they choose to represent themselves. While online content itself wasn't analysed in this study, some participants spoke about how social media shapes their real-life fishing experience. Some use it for fun, others use it professionally, but participants discussed the complexity of this self-presentation and the impact it can have on others, ranging from feeling inspired to disappointed or even insecure in response to certain types of content. Representation also extends into fisheries management. Several participants served on advisory or advocacy bodies valued for their experience and expertise, rather than to represent women specifically. Still, some question whether government and organisations truly listen to women's voices equally. Businesses play a key role in shaping the recreational fishing sector and can either enable or create barriers. For example, through knowledge sharing and providing suitable gear. Tackle shops, for instance, may be seen as either intimidating or as a valuable source of important information. Participants also noted a lack of products designed specifically for women, like wetsuits for spearfishing or tailored rods. There was a clear business case for better catering to women. Participants saw women as valuable customers, influencers within their families, and contributors to increased spending through their partners and kids because of their roles in determining household spending. Beyond customers, 6 participants own or work in recreational fishing businesses, from charters and tackle shops to apparel, media, and advocacy. All reported facing sexism, harassment, or bullying in some way. Some women in leadership or advisory roles said that they're pushing for change within their organizations and across the industry. And 2 highlighted the need to create job pathways for young women, with 1 emphasizing that they should feel they can enter this sector without needing to be a bikini. So in conclusion, I hope that the themes and quotes I've shown reveal the value of exploring women's perspectives in recreational fishing, revealing aspects of the sector that are often overlooked. While equal participation rates can be seen as progress, the way these stats are measured just based on someone fishing once a year means they often don't reflect the really complex details that are happening underneath the surface. So though this is just a small sample and some preliminary findings, I hope this reveals the need for future study in this area to explore the deeper intersectional aspects of the NT's recreational fishing community. It's certainly clear that the NT offers a unique example for recreational fishing communities across Australia and internationally, particularly those aiming to boost women's participation. But more understanding is needed to truly promote equitable access to marine and freshwater spaces. Thank you. A huge thanks to all of the participants and all of the stakeholders who gave their advice and input in the study as well. And thanks to Natasha Stacey for overseeing the research and putting this collection together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenny and Nilanjana. It's a pleasure to have you both here today. And we have about 15 minutes or so for questions from both people in the room and from people who might be online. If you're online, feel free to type a question into the chat box at the top of the screen, and one of us will read it out to the speakers. Anyone have any questions? I see one question back there. One arm up.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to remind Nilanjana and Jenny to give a plug for their papers that you both neglected to mention. So
These are not published.
the results of these 2 studies have been published in a journal called Maritime Studies. So I don't know if we don't have a slide there that you can pick up, but you can read the full detailed results there, and they're part of a broader collection of papers published with support from the university on encountering maritime Northern Australia perspectives on sea country fisheries and livelihoods. Actually, the title's changed. So there's a number of papers there, but we can share that link later on.
I think it's in the RIEL digest if you want.
Yeah. Thanks, but well done. Great work. Real major contributions to the study of fisheries and maritime studies here.
Can I ask a question, Jenny?
Yes.
So it's 2,500 jobs in the rec. Do we know what those jobs look like?
So this is a result of the national study that it included direct jobs, but also associated roles. So it includes things like the actual, what we would think of as rec fishing jobs, like charters or tackle shops and everything like that. But it also includes any peripheral, my understanding, I wasn't involved in that original study, but my understanding is it includes anything surrounding it as well. So that would be tourism associated with recreational fishing or hospitality industry. So if people are traveling to different destinations to go fishing there on their holidays, then anything that is linked with that would be included in that number and also in the economic contribution statistic that I showed. So it's quite complicated, like how they've actually calculated that. So
They exist.
yeah,
So, yeah.
but I think something that would be interesting to look at in the future is to kind of delve into that number a bit more, look at some of the details, and perhaps even see if you could look at women's participation in that economic contribution as well. That would be really fascinating.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, thanks, it's a great question.
Sam?
Thanks. Jenny, a question for you. I mean, I know your study's NT based, but just your general feel about things. Do you think there's, much of this is quite place specific in terms of states within Australia, or comparing here to, the US or any other country sort of thing? Do you kind of get the feeling that there's a bit of difference there, or is it sort of?
Yes, yeah, definitely. In Australia, the only other state and territory that has a comparable participation rate gender gap is South Australia, which has like a almost equal. They're like 1% out, so they're almost there. So that's probably the most similar example, but a lot of other parts of the country are very different for many reasons, including the rules around licensing. And I think you'd probably be able to speak more to that than I would. But licensing and also the type of population, other activities that are available to do, and like a general culture and kind of like the territory and lifestyle, I guess, is a big factor. But if we look at the international context, as I mentioned, the overall participation rate in other industrialized countries is much lower than here in the NT. So we're already very different before we even look at the gender dynamics. And then when we look at that, that's even bigger difference, because the gender gap is typically much more pronounced than Australia, but also like the NT even more so. But there's been like a lot of pushing for increasing women's participation in other countries, especially in the UK and the US. We see like a big push, Canada as well. In the UK, there was like a recent news story where like a very prestigious, long-standing recreational fishing group that's existed for like decades or 100 years or something finally voted to allow women for the first time, after like extensive campaigning on social media by women involved in the rec sector who are activists and are pushing for equal inclusion. So what we're talking about is not just that there's no official barriers and there's a cultural change that's needed. We're still talking about a sector that has open discrimination in contexts, in terms of some of these formal groups and organizations. So I think this is an interesting example that other contexts can learn from. I think a particularly interesting aspect is the role of women's competitions in pushing this social change. I think it's a cultural shift that maybe would have happened anyway, but it's probably been accelerated through the competitions, through women who are really active in the sector, really campaigning and pushing for that, using social media, using traditional media, and being very strategic about kind of pushing this social norm to change over, basically 20 years. So there's a lot of inspiration, I think, that other places can come from and can take from this example. And we've seen that through initiatives like the Women's Recreational Fishing League or other organizations across the country that they're trying to kind of learn from some of those examples.
Zach, do we have any questions online?
No, not online yet.
Okay.
If I could just add to that, a couple of years ago, I went to the World Recreational Fishing Conference in Darwin, and the sessions about gender and women in fishery really confined to a small number of mostly Victorian women's groups that started fishing during COVID. And so there is a World Recreational Fishing Conference in Cape Town, I think, early in the new year. But again, like what we see in other disciplines in fisheries around the world in terms of gender inclusion and discussions about fisheries and feminisation and intersectionality and stuff is just not present yet in the recreational fishing sector at a global level. So there is great opportunity for us to promote what's happening here in Australia in other parts of the world as well.
Yes.
Jenny, I just wondered if local businesses know about your work, because just realising or maybe they're already onto it, and that's why we've got the participation, but just the role of shops, like it would be worth communicating your findings to them, I would imagine.
Yeah, thanks, Penny.
Yeah.
So some already are aware, and as I mentioned, some of the participants are involved in those businesses. But we were just talking about through AFANT, like the opportunities to share with the members about the research and what's going on.
Yeah.
So that's on our list.
What are the prospects for local processing with commercial fishing?
It's a very good question. There have been 2 sector reports that have heavily recommended local processing and spoken to the Northern Territory's unique advantages in terms of accessing markets in Asia. Although there are many dimensions to that, but certainly there have been recommendations from major studies that have said yes, if this is something that needs, but it hasn't been consistent policies.
Right. Fishing processing business that was closed down because of the challenges in being able to get funded and get assistance. Even the industry's contributed, and we're just asking as a contribution of government to be able to stay open and viable, to start up.
Yeah, it requires a shift in terms of policy impact.
Any other questions?
No question. I just had a little comment from your talk, Nilanjana. I was kind of reminded that how quickly things can slip backwards. You know, maybe that's no grand insight in 2025. I don't know, but we sort of tend to think once we get to a good place, job's done. But it's very easy with a little change in an industry or something like that to go way back to a space of inequality very quickly.
Very true. It's a really good observation. Also, if you see what's happening across the world, a certain form of growth has been sort of encouraged, which is based really on regulating only certain aspects of fishing. So these are environmental, economic, sort of they merge in such a way that the sector itself begins to rely heavily on migrant labor finally. This is happening in the US, this is happening in Europe, this is also happening in Australia. So my initial research is pointing in that direction, that large companies, which after all are the only ones that can actually stay in the business, who consolidate, who have the because this is capital intensive fishing that we're talking about now. So it's only very large players that can actually be in this environment. And then the logical extension of labor practice then becomes to hire migrant labor, which is good for migrant labor. It's also good in terms of certain diversity. But there is pushback from local populations who suddenly feel that they're losing their jobs. They feel that things that were very cheap 20 years ago are very difficult to buy. They're being manufactured abroad. Australia, I've heard this time and again. This is not good. because it speaks of backlash, speaks of, as you say, a reversal of gains. And the problem then can get shifted onto equally vulnerable sections of the population rather than sort of structural interrogation of what's going on. In the NT, we also have the promotion of recreational fishing as a conscious government strategy from 1980 onwards, or late 70s onwards, you know, the promotion on sort of, because the government was looking to diversify revenue resources, more places from where money can come in. And certainly the recreational sector has been sort of promoted in that sense. And it is, like Jenny's talk sort of so wonderfully showed, it's creating tertiary employment of certain kinds. But what about the core employment in fishing itself, you know? And also it's unlicensed. So, and we don't have data. So you really can't say how much fish is being caught through recreational terms and compare it in terms of commercial. So there are many contradictions that are steadily creeping into the sector.
Is that it? Okay, no more questions? Oh, we got one more story here. Please go back there.
Nice book, Angela and Jenny. So have you seen the skill gap?
The skill gap.
The skill gap, yeah.
There is, I think Debbie can speak to that in terms of a specific figure. We have an exact figure of the skill gap in terms of NT seafood.
Industry Skills Advisory Council have papers on both the agriculture and commercial fishing operations, and they show specific NT data of the jobs and the environment. There's vocational education qualifications that people can enter. In terms of the enrolment levels, it's a lot higher in the agriculture and almost non-existent in the commercial and sector. So there's an opportunity.
Debbie, correct me if I'm wrong, haven't yet come across a number. For example, Seafood Industry Australia has tried to quantify that, you know, they say around 46% in terms of there's a gap in terms of what the industry needs and what is available.
Yeah.
But I'm yet to see that figure for the Northern Cape.
Yeah, we can have a look at what it's been written by ISAC&T's papers, and if there is a gap, we can suggest that they may be included in the next application.
Perfect.
Yeah. Sorry for the wildcatch, I should say the skills, because it's so highly regulated, it's your maritime qualifications. Everyone goes straight to being able to work on a vessel. But in terms of the seafood processing and the post-harvest, it's a lot longer. We've got a report that we've published. It's a national report for low enrolments. So it might be something to do and have a look at in the Skills Insight website. And it talks about the big gap in training opportunities.
Do you find a skill gap in the field that you're researching?
No, what I want to raise is that the gender gap may be associated or correlated with skill gap, because modern technology is more advanced, and that is why you are seeing less women participating in the industry. So if there is a skill gap, then we have to work up to increase women participation by giving them more training and familiarizing them with the new technologies.
Right. I do agree with you that a part of the component is technological improvements. However, at least in wild caught, what is happening is there's an offshoreization, right? So larger and larger vessels that operate for days on end in offshore waters, that kind of employment doesn't suit women who are tasked with performing domestic responsibilities. The main onus of domestic responsibilities usually falls on women's shoulders. So to sort of go away for 3 months, 5 months at a stretch becomes a little difficult. So there's a structural issue here. And I do agree with you, however, that part of the problem can be addressed with better skilling and training.
The change of technology with AI, jobs are starting to move more into the office than out on the water, because technology is allowing to do some of that.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, I haven't seen it so much in the territory, but in Tasmania, those jobs look very different. And again, that's sitting in the agriculture, not the commercial fishing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so that again speaks to a huge opportunity for upskilling. But then again, we are talking of upskilling all segments in the workforce, including Aboriginal communities and local populations as well. So there are challenges which I believe can be addressed. It's been done in many other parts as well.
Well, I think we probably need to close for today. But thank you both, Nilanjana and Jenny, for listening today and for all of you coming in. I'm sorry.
I just got one question
Oh,
from Sally.
last minute, okay.
Nilanja, this is a question for you. How might your research guide industry efforts to improve workplace practices and job design to grow women's participation?
Oh, there are a large, of course, please bear in mind this is ongoing research. So the second part of my research addresses what is happening in today's time. And the third part of my research is based on, policy analysis, which can actually speak directly to that. But even if we look at the past, as I have done here, there are many areas in which changes can be made by making, by linking the direction of fisheries management in the Northern Territory and aligning it more closely to the needs of the Northern Territory. First, I would say you must have at least a workforce profile. What does your workforce look like in the Northern Territory? That itself becomes an important starting point. And I'm happy to see that FRDC is making some move towards that direction. I think that is 70 years already too late, but highly needed. We need to know who are the people. Because if I say, okay, 2,000 women are employed in the Northern Territory seafood workforce, on what basis will you either refute that or corroborate that claim? We need to know who's in the workforce. So I think the first big start can be from there itself. And then, of course, that will allow us to identify what skills are lacking, what are the areas where, more women can be brought in. How can STEM education be improved for women? How can this be taken to remote regional Australia? Thank you.
Alrighty. Just a reminder, we have morning tea over in Yellow 2, the lunchroom up on the second floor. You're all welcome to join us. And thanks again for everyone who joined us online. I don't know how many people there were online today, but we have quite a few people here today in person. So well done. Thanks again.
Thank you.
It's also the Diwali celebration morning tea as well. So anyone's welcome to come and join.